June happened, so it is time for me to talk about what I played during it. The majority of my gaming time throughout the month was spent on Shadow of the Erdtree. I was fortunate enough to get an early review code because I'm so on top of putting out timely videos, so I got to play a lot before release. And honestly, when it actually came out, I was surprised by the fairly mixed response on it because I had an utter blast playing it. For starters, I found the bosses to be both the hardest and also most fun in the entire game. I thoroughly enjoyed learning every fight, including the last one, which I won't spoil, but yeah, even that I found fun to figure out. I know that is not a super common opinion though. Now, I definitely do respect the frustrations some people had with the difficulty of the DLC. I think the design of some bosses makes it hard to stick to strategies that always worked in the base game, but I didn't really run into that kind of frustration because of the build I used, which was based around the deflecting hard tier. And in my opinion, it's the best addition of the DLC. Essentially, it operates similarly to the deflect in stuff like Sekiro and Lies of P. So if you time a block perfectly, you can negate all damage without losing stamina, and then retaliate with a guard counter if there's an opening. This added a whole new layer to fights as I could be so much more aggressive. Instead of always waiting for an enemy attack chain to end, I'd sneak in as many hits as I could in the hopes I'd get staggers on them to punish them for tons of damage. Frankly, I wish the deflect was just a base mechanic everyone could use instead of being tied to the wondrous physic, because it honestly feels like a handful of bosses were designed with it in mind. I know a complaint plenty of people have had about Elden Ring is that so much of it is just waiting and rolling until you can get one hit in, and I think the deflect solves that issue. And yeah, I now want to do a playthrough of the base game while using it because that just sounds super fun. I didn't end up using any summons to beat bosses because I am brain broken and need to win with big sword only, but more so than any FromSoft game before it, I was tempted to for lore reasons alone. The DLC does a lot of cool stuff with NPCs that make quests and various interactions have significant impacts, which I love to see. Also, a few are featured in boss fights in pretty cool ways, and it all makes me want to replay the DLC to see all the various kinds of interactions and moments I missed. Maybe the most impressive thing about the DLC is its art direction, which is impeccable. Genuinely, these are some of my favorite looking areas in FromSoft's entire catalog. I was in awe every time I reached a new place. The ideas and the way those ideas are realized are always interesting and surprising. And yeah, it's just the kind of world that is special to witness. Now, I will say that while the areas are visually engaging, the use of the actual spaces in the game sometimes feels underwhelming. To be clear, there is a ton of content in the DLC and lots of neat items to collect, but despite the world itself being more dense due to how it uses verticality, there doesn't feel like there is as much to uncover per square foot as there is in the base game. A handful of regions really only have one major thing to do in them, and this can lead to long chunks of time where you're just riding on torrent looking for something to meaningfully engage with. For the most part, this didn't bother me, but there were a few times I came across incredibly cool looking areas that seemed filled with mystery and promise, and walked away from them having pretty much done nothing of substance. This certainly happens in the base game too, but given the scope of the DLC, it is way more noticeable here. Pretty much, while I wasn't disappointed with how much stuff was in the DLC, I did find myself a bit let down by how it was spread out. Also, and I'm gonna continue griping for a bit, so strap in, while I did like the boss fights, the DLC does suffer from the somewhat common FromSoft problem of boss too big for arena-itis. Especially with the Dancing Lion and Golden Hippo, there were just one too many times where I had no idea where the fuck I was. I guess this could be considered a skill issue as it's on me to focus on positioning to make sure I don't get caught against a wall, and yeah, okay, sure, fine, but there are certainly times where depending on how a boss strings moves together, it can feel a bit unfair. Also, I don't think camera management is an interesting skill to master, at least not in this kind of game. So I wish that they had a better solution for it, although I don't really know what that would look like, so maybe it just is what it is. Like in the base game, I know a lot of people were bothered by reused enemies, but for the most part, I didn't have an issue with them with the exception of dragons, which I got pretty tired of. Aside from actual boss dragons like Bale, they are pretty boring to fight, and it's a shame because in theory a dragon attack should be extremely exciting, but instead they feel kind of tedious. Anyway, the discourse around the game has definitely died down a fair bit since release, but it was interesting to see people feel like the DLC was too hard, because while it definitely was a step up from the base game, it also seemed like a natural progression in difficulty. To be fair, I wasn't on New Game Plus, I stayed on top of collecting Shadow Tree fragments, and I think the deflecting hard tier really is the perfect counter to the increased boss aggression in the DLC. easy. Point is, I probably didn't have as much friction as many other players. With that said, my takeaway from many of the complaints was that a lot of people just want Dark Souls 4. They want to go from boss to boss without having character progression be so tied to exploration, and I get that. I think while the gameplay loop of Elden Ring is great, it is one that can be hard to stomach at times, as a lot of people want to figure out how to beat a boss when they first come across it. They don't want the answer to be that they need to get to a higher level or gather a certain amount of collectible to stand a chance. They want the answer to be just getting skilled enough to overcome it. But in Elden Ring, that isn't always possible without a stupid amount of bashing your head against the wall. I get why some people want to shift away from this open world approach. As someone who loves the exploration aspect, I don't really feel the same, but I do understand it. All in all, complaints aside, I found this DLC to be a great send-off to Elden Ring. It is the most challenged I've ever felt by a FromSoft game, and that led to so many satisfying moments throughout the playthrough. It delivered the feeling that I always want to get from these games, so yeah, I liked it a lot. After Shadow of the Erdtree, I played Hextech Mayhem, another game published by the now defunct Riot Forge, and it was fine. It's a runner, and I'm not super into runners, so I guess that's kind of on me, but it definitely was charming enough. The music is solid and made better by how it is incorporated into the gameplay. Actions are all tied to the beat, and when you string together a long combo, the screen shifts in color and the music gets louder and more instruments are added, drawing you into a sort of flow state. Missing an input then sets the music back to normal, and there is something so deflating about how that feels. And I mean that as a good thing, because it makes you want to get better so you can always stay in the flow state. Along with the directed inputs that show up on screen, you can also get even more points by doing inputs based on cues in the level itself. So if you see a platform, you can probably jump up to it, and if you see a blue light, you should probably throw a bomb at it. I found the vast majority of these to be super easy to miss, especially when focused on the directed inputs, but I do like that observant players can get rewarded with more points for noticing them and successfully inputting them. Also, once you beat the game, you can turn on a setting that shows all the hidden prompts, allowing you to have the more input-intensive experience without needing to spot every cue in the actual level. It's pretty much just a clever way to introduce a hard mode. Progression in the game is tied to both completing levels and also collecting a certain amount of special gears in order to build a mech for the boss fight of each zone. In theory, this is cool as it pushes players to learn each level and look for secrets, but I also never came close to not having the necessary amount of parts to be able to progress, even though there were plenty of levels I did terribly at. So yeah, while I do like this kind of progression system, the skill floor is so low that it felt kind of pointless. One thing I wasn't a fan of is that when you hit an obstacle, instead of being sent back to a checkpoint, you continue moving along almost like a ghost until you enter another input and get back to actually playing. This leads to skipping over pretty significant chunks of each level when you take a hit. The approach prioritizes completing levels over truly learning them, and because the progression system isn't demanding in the slightest, you really can just cakewalk through everything. I wish that they had given me more of a reason to actually learn the levels. There is a fair bit of mechanical depth to the game, and if I were more intrinsically motivated, I probably would have dug deeper into it, but as this isn't a genre I love, I didn't have the patience to just do it for the sake of doing it. Had the game provided more motivation to engage with its depth, for instance by making it harder to progress without demonstrating some amount of mastery over each level, I would have had a much better time with it. So yeah, if you like runners and League of Legends characters, you'll probably have a good time with it, but I don't think it will change anyone's mind about the genre. I then finish up the month with Sheepy, a short adventure, a game produced by the music channel Mr. Suicide Sheep. Above all else, the game has a killer aesthetic. The art style is incredibly rich and charming, and the animations are just so smooth, making the world not only interesting to see, but also interesting to move through. Its art and music do a really effective job of establishing tone. As you'd expect from something associated with Mr. Suicide Sheep, the soundtrack plays a big role, featuring an electronic heavy dynamic soundtrack made by musicians who are often featured on the channel, and it knows exactly when to hit you with the sound of despair and when to hit you with the sound of hope. It builds and falls always at the right time and is just a real treat. I really can't state enough how stellar the title's presentation is. It just feels good to engage with. As far as the actual gameplay, it's pretty simple. It has a few ideas that I felt could have been expanded on in neat ways, but I don't really think the goal of the game was to be mechanically deep. The gameplay is largely in service of the spectacle, so I think it's probably for the best that it didn't try to include anything that might get in the way of players engaging with said spectacle. Although I will say there are these optional collectibles you can find throughout the levels, and I felt overly compelled to get them all, which did lead to me undercutting one of the game's more powerful moments because I kept turning around to find one, not knowing that I had missed it a while back. Now, one thing that I definitely think is worth mentioning is that the game is free, which makes it super easy for me to recommend to you because all it takes is your time. And I think the game is easily worth the hour or so it will take you to beat it. The spectacle feels great, and it has a handful of interesting aspects that you'll probably be thinking about well after you're done playing it. When researching its development, I also found out that it was made by one guy, Thomas Lean, and it's also his first game, which is wildly impressive. All in all, it's a neat little experience that you'll probably have a nice time with. Okay, that's it. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time unless I decide to stop doing this. And you know what? This time it is a threat.